Welcome, everyone. We see participants filing into our virtual auditorium. Thank you for joining us. We'll give it just another moment for a few other folks to join the call.
Good evening, Ken. We have someone who said good evening in the chat function. Thank you. If I may, we had to the panelists, someone said, thank you for hosting this. What a needed respite from the strange world of the last few days. So yes, I would agree. Respite for us as well. If anyone is having any audio issues, would you indicate so in the chat? We had someone say that they were having an issue. Oh boy, we have 102 people here. What a great group. Very exciting. We have another question. Someone asked how long the webinar is. We've scheduled an hour. I have a feeling it might go over a bit. So if you need to go and want to ask some questions, you want to send them to us ahead of time, we can answer them. But we will try to keep it to an hour, although we've had some long discussions already. So just stay with us if you can. Someone also asked, is this spools of thread behind me? And yes, it is. My grandmother was a seamstress for 70 years, and these are her vintage spools. They give me comfort to have around me. So thank you for asking. If no one else has any logistical or audiovisual questions, which you can always ask us about, I'm gonna turn it over to Lizzie for a few minutes.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah.
And welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Barker, the Executive Director of the Frick Pittsburgh, and it's such a pleasure to have participants joining us from all over the country. We have a wonderful panel in store for you tonight, and our panelists have worked really hard to bring you a special presentation. We have audience members joining us from both coasts and in the middle. And I wanted to give a special thank you to members of the Frick Societies, the leadership donors whose generous support allows us to bring experiences such as this one, ones that we hope you will find inspiring and exciting about art, history, and nature to all who might benefit from participating. We're really glad you're here. We hope if you enjoy this evening's program, you'll consider coming back. We offer lots of things, and these days it's just as easy as a click on the computer screen. I'll turn things over to my colleague, Lisa Viscusi, who will introduce our panelists and take my seat in the virtual auditorium, and look forward to seeing you again at the Q&A.
I was muted. I typically don't do that, but I was. It happens. Hello again, everyone. I'm Lisa Viscusi. I'm the manager of adult learning at the Frick Pittsburgh Museum and Gardens. And I'm here along with my colleague, Dawn Reid Brean, who is the Associate Curator of Decorative Arts at the Frick. And we together and the whole Frick family are delighted to welcome our colleagues from afar, from the coasts. We have Elee Wood, who is the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. We have Michelle Grohe, the Curator of Education at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston as well. And sorry about that ringing. Someone just mentioned that we are on speaker spotlight for guests. Is everyone okay? Does everyone see everybody? If anyone wants to throw up in the chat who you can see, and we will adjust that as we go along. Okay. I'm gonna try that. Keep letting us know, please. I'm gonna try to fix it in a second, but in the meantime, I will tell you that we know most people have used Zoom, and but I just want to go over a few quick things before we hop into it, so everyone has the ability to hear, see, and ask questions. If you hover at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a number of options. There's a chat function, which if you click on the chat function, you can message the panelists, or you can message one person individually if you have a question. If you're going to ask a question for the group here, please send it to either all the panelists or me, as I will be sort of letting them do their thing, and I'll help to field the questions. And then if you you don't have mute or you don't have audio or video, so we don't have to worry about that. And I think there's a closed caption button at the bottom if you want to see. I don't know, actually, no, I'm take that back. It does not do automatic captions, but otherwise you can also speak to other participants in the participant panel list on your right-hand side that will come up. And I think that's all. We will also be we're gonna do some chatting with do an overview with our panelists, and then we are going to do Q&A at the end. And we would love for you to throw out your questions during as well. It's not just reserved for the end. This is an open discussion. Don't we need an open discussion, everyone? So I'm gonna invite our panelists, Dawn, Elee, and Michelle, to talk about a little bit about themselves and do an overview of their institutions. And then we're gonna head into some big questions about exploring museums' multiple histories. So welcome everyone, say hello. Dawn, if you want to go first, and then we'll move along.
Sure, if you can pull up the PowerPoint, we can share a couple of images. I'm Dawn Brein. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm really excited for this discussion, and I'm really thankful to Elee and Michelle for joining us. For anyone who's not familiar with the Frick Pittsburgh, we are a really multifaceted site. Our 5.5 acre campus encompasses grounds, a historic house museum, an art museum, as well as a car and carriage museum. And our entire site is a result of one person's vision, which is our founder, Helen Clay Frick. She's the surviving daughter and the youngest child of notorious industrialist and art collector Henry Clay Frick. And when her father died in 1919, she inherited $38 million and became the richest single woman in America at the age of 31. She never married, she never had children. She devoted her entire life to her philanthropic endeavors and the institutions that she established and nurtured, many of which were really aimed at bolstering her father's legacy. The art museum opened in 1970 to house her personal collection, and Clayton, her childhood home at Clayton, opened to the public as a historic house museum in 1990. So last year marked 2 anniversaries for our institution, and we were really looking inward. In November, we opened an exhibition, and you see a gallery view here called the Frick Reflex, looking back, moving forward. And the purpose of this exhibition was really to mark those 2 anniversaries with a more introspective and critical look at our institutional origin story and our collection. We're asking ourselves a lot of questions, and this exhibition invites our visitors to consider those questions with us. So while I think, it looks like a traditional exhibition installation, but we really took a different tack with objects that are well known to our visitors and highlighting some new objects as well. So we can move to the next slide. In this installation, if you want to move forward one more, in this installation, we're really asking, whose stories do museums tell and whose stories are excluded? We're also questioning what are the values that guided the founding of our institution and whether or not those values continue to guide us today. I think we know that, museums are built on structures of power and exclusion, and we have to acknowledge and confront our past before we can decide how we want to move forward.
All right, Elee, if you want to say a few words.
Great. Do you want me to start with my institution?
If you want to introduce yourself, that would be lovely.
So my name is Elee Wood. I am currently the Nadine and Robert A. Schottheim Director of Education and Public Programs at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens, which is not the longest title I've ever held in my life, but I have been at the Huntington for about 2.5 years at this point. I started off as the Fielding Collection Curator Educator, which is a collection of early American art and artifacts. Before that, I was a professor of museum studies at Indiana University and spent a lot of time professing museum work, and actually really happy to be back. I got my museum start in the 20th century at the Milwaukee Public Museum as a youth volunteer, and have spent much of my professional life in museums of all types. So I'm a full-on museum geek.
All right. Thank you, Elee. Oh, do you want to then talk about the institution a bit?
Sure, I can give you a little bit. Do you want to pop up those slides? They look so similar, and yet that's not. So I thought maybe I would add a little more color to the question. Gilded is not golden, but maybe it's green. The Huntington is really very well known for its gardens, but in fact we have 3 significant collections. If you go to the next slide, I just give you, oops, missed a few pieces of information there. This is a that's okay. I can wing it. This is just a couple of examples of the kinds of things that we have. We have a very significant research library that has about 11 million items ranging from the 11th to the 21st century, which includes any number of things. I like to joke, if you think we have it, we probably do, but we have things that range from a copy of the Gutenberg Bible and the Ellesmere Chaucer Canterbury Tales, all the way through immigration records of Y.C. Hong, who helped Chinese immigrants pass tests, become citizens, and anything else in between. We have an art museum that collects primarily in British, European, and American art from the 15th to the 20th century. Blue Boy is our most well-known painting. You can see him there in the middle of that. One of those, that art collection. And then we also have 120 acres of gardens that comprise 16 different thematic spaces, from a newly opened Chinese garden that's modeled on a Ming Dynasty scholar's garden. We have a Japanese garden, a very extensive desert garden collection, roses, a conservatory, et cetera, we sort of have it all. We can provide all manner of things to support your aesthetic and botanical needs.
Thank you. I'm trying to flip. I'm going to stop.
Yeah, if you go to the next one, I was going to, I don't know if the slides didn't translate, but there we go. There's our founders. Yeah. Arabella and Henry E. Huntington were the founders of the Huntington. They gave their estate to the city of San Marino. And I have just a little snippet from our indenture, which was that we were to be created as a public library for the advancement of learning in the arts and sciences and to promote the public welfare. We opened officially to the public in 1924. The indenture was developed in 1919. Henry Huntington was the recipient of his uncle's wealth of railroad, and he himself was a great builder and real estate developer. His wife, Arabella, was a rival to Isabella. Much of the European and British art collections that we have. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Elee. I think these are some photos as well.
We'll come back to those later.
Okay, great. So Michelle, if you'd like to say a few things as well.
Sure. So, hi, good evening. My name is Michelle Grohe. I'm the Esther Stiles Eastman Curator of Education at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Really happy to be here. I think this is a really timely topic, so I really appreciate the invitation to dive into it together. So, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is named after its founder. If you want, I just wanted to show here that the Gardner Museum is pretty well known for a couple of different things. One is that the historic building that Isabella Stewart Gardner was very involved in the planning and design of, in the central courtyard, looks like the exterior of kind of an Italian Venice palazzo or palace. We have a lot of different types of art, different types of plants. We also are well known for a couple other things, such as the installation and the collection itself can never be added to, pieces removed or changed in any way. It needs to exist exactly how it was left in 1924 when Isabella Stewart Gardner died. We also, unfortunately, are the site of one of the most expensive art thefts in 1990, which you can, I invite you to explore on our website. But if you go to the next slide, just to give a little bit of background.
Sorry, Mike, every time I hit this button, it is mad at me for some reason. So give me a second here. There we go.
Yeah, so just wanted to show you a couple of different images of some of the rooms. So we have two different buildings. The historic building, like I said, Isabella Stewart Gardner was really involved in. That part of the building opened in 1903. So I think a lot of our founders are from similar time periods. So Isabella Stewart Gardner was born in 1840. She married Jack Gardner, lived here in Boston beginning in 1860. They traveled all around the world, exploring different cultures, different types of art, creativity. She was a very active patron of art of her time, as well as supporting many scholars, artists in their own development. And over time, she became just very involved, very interested in collecting different types of art, particularly Italian Renaissance. And there's a lot of pieces, so kind of similar to some of the other things we've been talking about, and really decided to create the museum towards the end of the 19th century. She really loved collecting things and arranging them in really interesting and personal ways. So the Gardner Museum was built at the turn of the century and opened publicly in 1903. She decided where everything would go. It does not follow a particular chronology or things like that. It's really arranged by what she thought would go really well together. It also changed quite a bit throughout her lifetime because she also lived at the museum on the top floor in a private apartment. And as her collection kept developing, she would change and move things around. So like I said, when she died in 1924, she left a very specific will that said we cannot change. It needs to stay exactly in the vision and the installation of Isabella Stewart Gardner. So the other interesting aspect of visiting the museum is we do not have labels in the galleries. So It's really meant to be a very visual and very personal experience as well for the visitors. Some visitors really like that. Some visitors are a little bit more frustrated. So we offer a variety of resources and assistance to help as visitors make their ways around. If you go to the next slide, yeah, just I wanted to show an image here of Isabella Stewart Gardner. This is a portrait that John Singer Sargent painted of her. And I also have another painting by John Singer Sargent called El Jaleo. So I just wanted to give a little bit of introduction of what she looked like and some of the things that we have at the museum. And I think that was it for the introductory part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, thank you. It's good to get a background. When we were having a discussion earlier, the four of us, about the program and what our goals were to talk about today, we realized that we each of us work in, not sheltered per se, but we are regional for the most part, and we sort of have all these mitigating factors that make us a little bit more insular, and the fact that we're all single founder museums that came about in the Gilded Age, that's very specific. And so looking at the Gilded Age and look at the title, Gilded is not golden. So it doesn't mean that everything was perfect. It doesn't mean that necessarily even the basis for our museums it's problematic sometimes. And we want to really look at that and start looking at it on a regular basis and doing it together. I think we've all done it at our organizations with our colleagues and maybe, with our visitors, et cetera, but getting together as colleagues to talk about that and talk about that with those of you who've joined us today, which thank you so much for being with us. I think it's important. And we've stumbled upon many topics that we won't even be able to cover tonight. So I hope that we keep having these conversations. And thank you for the overview. I just want to say, just to reiterate that in light of the difficult time that we've all found ourselves in, we're in a health pandemic, a racial crisis, an upturned, unstable political environment. We were particularly interested in having this discussion to take a deeper look into our museums, the type of museums we have, and gardens and libraries, of course. And tonight we want to engage in a discussion with all of you and with our panelists about the challenges of exploring the layered stories of our museums. We started to think about at the Frick, whose stories get told and whose don't. Who's missing from the narrative? That I think was sort of the driving force of, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Dawn, of what the direction we started going in. And I want to hear from Elee and Michelle as well about your journeys to do that, and how this year in particular has changed us as organizations. Things professionally and personally have blended. What we believe has come out more, we've been more vulnerable, I think, as individuals, as museum professionals, and we are more vulnerable in opening up our visitors to be more vulnerable as well. So how do we get at that? How do we honor that? And so I'm gonna put the first question to Dawn, and then please chime in, the others. How does a collection assembled in privilege speak to us now? That's a question we're posing for our current exhibition. So I'd love to hear Dawn, hear what you have to say.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the questions that was guiding our formation of the exhibition. And I think for a lot of people, the term Gilded Age can conjure these romanticized visions of Downton Abbey or Bridgerton, if you're engaging in the latest Netflix show. This kind of nostalgic romantic vision of the past. And that's just not what the Gilded Age really was. It's right there in the title of this program. Gilded is not golden. Gilt refers to a super thin layer of gold on top of a base material of little worth. And as it was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, as it was a pejorative, derogatory term meant to call attention to the corruption and greed of the era. And Helen Clay Frick viewed her childhood at Clayton with such tender nostalgia that she preserved her family home and she enabled it to be open as a historic house museum. But we can't escape the fact that her life is far from the lived reality of most Americans of that time period. I mean, for most people, this is a period of immense disparities in wealth, violent labor conflicts like the one at Homestead here in Pittsburgh, racial segregation, a lot of issues that are still resonant today. And I think, the issues of yesterday, for me, certainly reinforced the need to engage with the past and to understand where we're coming from. It helps me kind of untangle how I'm thinking and how I'm feeling about how we are in the present. And I think we have a responsibility to have those conversations with our visitors and to share that we don't know the answers either, and that we are also thinking about these things like them. We're not coming at everything from an era of authority.
Thank you, Dawn. Elee, Michelle, do you want to
I
follow?
just thinking about something that I can add in. My internet's a little unstable, so I hope I will not fall apart here. Just thinking about what Dawn just said is that there's so many layers to the individuals who establish these institutions that we can't deny that, and yet we somehow kind of revert to them as our, for whatever it is, our heroes, perhaps, maybe not heroes. But one of the things that I think is tricky is just being willing to explore that is really important. And because the Huntington is a research library, in addition to gardens and grounds, there's a lot of opportunities that we have for researchers to come in and explore things. And in fact, one of our current researchers, Natalia Molina, is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, which is pretty cool. She's actually studying the influence of Mexican American workers on the development of the grounds, and that will become a really, really great exploration of our history and something that has really not been explored before. We also had a centennial celebration that started in 2019, where we really started to begin to look very carefully at what both Henry and Arabella contributed to the institution. But because so much of what has happened for us has evolved over time, I think things start to change and you get layers of history of the development. And so that's an interesting difference across our three institutions, that time, people, and consequence, I think, contribute to how we can understand what we have in our collections.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Elee.
Yeah, I think just building on something Dawn was saying about authority and who has that authority with telling stories, that all three institutions had, it sounds like, very driven founders who had very personalized ways of looking at things as well. And they're a reflection of their time, just as we walking around are a reflection of our time. And I think, similarly to what we were saying, that there's a lot of these universal themes about humanity that we all can relate to, whether in seeing in the art or connecting with the founders themselves, or in a lot of ways, maybe not connecting with the Gardners or relating to the founders or relating to them. Maybe it's the opposite. So I think what's interesting, though, is that more and more museums are opening up different opportunities for different voices or different perspectives to be presented, maybe not just one at a time, but kind of in conversation with each other, whether that's through interpretation or programmatically. And so that's really exciting as well, because it's in a way like sharing that authority with visitors or other participants as well, and especially inviting lenses that may or may not be present amongst the staff or haven't been looked at more historically as well.
All right. Thank you. I just want to address quickly that people are still saying they can only see the speaker, and on my end that we haven't changed our settings. So the only thing I can think of is, and Michelle actually offered this, there is a view button somewhere on your screen, depending on if you're on your laptop or your iPhone or your iPad, there is a view button that you have the ability to toggle between speaker and gallery. So if you stay in gallery view, you should be able to see everybody. On mobile devices, you can't change the view. Okay, so I hope that fixes it for people on their laptops. No view button. One of my colleagues is trying to fix it. So, okay, I just wanted to put that out there because I'm getting a lot of questions about that in the chat.
I've noticed there's a question, Lisa, if I may, is Henry Frick the only one with an anti-union history? And the answer to that is definitively no. Henry Huntington was very anti-union and in fact tried to work without union labor on building his property.
All right, there's an answer. And actually, Dawn, there was a question. We'll get to this before we move on. When did the Frick begin to work on this installation? And I'll actually pose the next part to all of our panelists, because it is one of our big questions, which is how have you changed the way, or how have you gone forward with the way that you present, talk about, educate on your collection and your exhibitions and your story and your history. So the second part of the question is, or the comment is, the topic is so timely. I'm impressed if it was begun before the Black Lives Matter events of earlier this year. So I think we can, all of us can honestly offer our answers to that.
I think for us, the Frick Reflex exhibition was developed concurrently with all of the events that were happening this summer. With COVID closures, and kind of exhibition gallery shifting around with traveling schedules, we ended up with a gap in our programming schedule, and we wanted to fill it with something that marked our anniversary. And as we were thinking about it, and I think we already wanted to take a more reflective look at our institutional history, but as we were thinking about the ideas behind the show, George Floyd was killed, and the kind of unrest and the uprising that occurred after that, I think us in the curatorial department, we all were approaching it as individuals, and it really was shifting our own personal thinking, and it shifted how we were looking at our collection too, and how we wanted to look at objects a little bit differently, how our visitors might be looking at objects differently as well, and just raising a lot more questions for us. And I think that goes back to what Michelle said. Museums are not static entities at all. They are shaped by the people who come into contact with them, whether it is their founders, the staff, or their visitors.
Yes. Good question, or good answer. Do either of you, Elee or Michelle, want to respond to that as well?
Sure. I think that I'm going to drop in the chat a link to the exhibitions that were on view at the Gardner at the time. So although the collection and the display itself, we were not permitted to change them, we have a new building where we have quite a large exhibition space as well, and a few other areas that we can take a closer look at items from the collection, or invite artists to respond to what's at the Gardner in new and different ways. One of the exhibitions that we were working on was called Boston's Apollo, Thomas McKellar and John Singer Sargent. So going back to the theme of tonight about thinking about, the Gilded Age or Gilded Portraits, John Singer Sargent is an American painter who is really well known for conveying that particular aspect of American society, right? In the 19th and early 20th century. And in the collection of at the Gardner, Sargent was also really good friends with Isabella Stewart Gardner. They were really good friends, and we have a portfolio of drawings and a print that Sargent gifted to Gardner of drawings that he made of a Black model named Thomas McKellar. We learned through doing research that the drawings were used as preparatory sketches for a really large mural cycle that's actually on view across the street at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Huge, huge murals. All of the figures in the murals are white and half of them are female. Yet here we have these sketches of what is clearly a Black male model. So for us, you know, you can tell that story in a lot of different ways. Do we tell the story through the lens of, here are these beautiful drawings that John Singer Sargent made? Do we focus on the friendship between Gardner and Sargent? We made the decision to lean deeper into who was this Black model, Thomas McKellar, and what is his story? What's his background and what happened to him? And to really frame it through that lens. We also made the choice, so we had a curator, Nat Silver, who's the curator of our collection, who interpreted and wrote material for the exhibition, but again, sharing authority where but a lot of the voices that we included in the exhibition were from different scholars, different community members, especially those that self-identify as Black and Brown individuals, because as a staff that's predominantly white, we felt it was really important to really, again, think about these materials in different ways. So that was an exhibition that opened a month before COVID struck the United States and closed most of us down. So it was actually an interesting opportunity to see how, to then share as much of that work that we had done online on our website, both in terms of getting the labels online, but also finding innovative and creative ways to continue the programming, even though we were closed at the time. So there's various ways that we can kind of respond to that, but because the show opened before COVID, as well as when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others were killed, it also was an opportunity for a lot of those different perspectives to also reflect on, what does it mean to be Black in America today? What did it mean then? And to really have relevant contemporary conversations. So I think that was, it was just an interesting opportunity this in the past year.
Yeah.
So I spent some time thinking about this after we had the question and thinking, oh, we've been closed since March. We haven't, California had a much more rigorous shutdown process. And so our gardens reopened in May, but the art galleries since March. But I did a little bit of reflecting and thinking about what we've been trying to do. And we are actually on a trajectory that started just about a year earlier, where we began to really look at how we could continue to build our collections around underrepresented groups and different types of things. And Lisa, I don't know if you can go back to that extra slide that I had. We've been trying actively to collect art of artists of color and inviting artists to come and use our collections as an interpretive tool to give us ways of looking at our collection and seeing the collection through different artists' eyes and presenting that to the public. So we've had a series of art installations. There we go. Art installations on the top. If you can see, can you throw that into the full view there, Lisa?
Yeah, that's what I was just trying to do. Okay, there we go.
Ding, ding, ding. Almost there. One more.
Oh, I think that's the last one.
There we go. Okay, so on the top left, on the top left here, there you can see rolling down the grand staircase. That is a video. Ooh, we've gone too far now. A video by a local artist, Selena Casado, who is a Latina artist who took the whole concept of the Huntington and white privilege. It's sort of the privilege of the estate, and reinterpreted it in a video. So it's a really, and it's very uncomfortable for a lot of people to watch. They don't rolling down the stairs. Um, it's an interesting challenge for us to think about. On the top right, you'll see someone looking at a document. We acquired papers of Octavia E. Butler, who is a major African American science fiction writer, very well known, the most requested collection in the library. So another way for us to begin to see, how do we make this open to the public? It was an exhibition that was very popular. So there's a couple of other things that we've been working toward. You don't need to see all of it, but in this middle picture on the bottom, you'll see a portrait of Pinky, another one of our famous pieces. And then in the background, you can see a more contemporary piece that's by an artist named Lynette Yadam Boache. It's a temporary exhibit that was able to open just before we closed to the public, but it's our way of juxtaposing contemporary art by African American or other BIPOC artists to connect with our historic collections in ways that really get you to think differently. So that's just a couple of examples of things that we've been trying to do actively in terms of thinking about how we can share and show and think differently about our own collections without massively changing them.
Mm-hmm. Elee, you talking about the two paintings sort of near each other. I wanted to mention to everyone that the Huntington is a collecting organization, and the Gardner and the Frick are not. And so that also is a different, I know that when Dawn and I have been talking in the past, and then when we talked with Michelle, it's a particular challenge. You want to maybe reframe and retell stories, reframe narratives, and you aren't able to necessarily hide what you have or bring new things in, if you will. And so I imagine that is a particular challenge for maybe us, for the Frick and for the Gardner. Also, quickly, Elee, someone mentioned that you did break up quite just a little bit, actually, when you were talking about the staircase piece. Could you just go over that one more time, what it was?
Sure. It's the artist's name is Selena Casado. She's an LA-based artist, and she basically was she's a media-based artist, created a video of what you might consider migrant workers or other Latina women in a garden or something like that. So she essentially was commenting on, I'm sorry, it always happens at this time of day. It really was just sort of a commentary on the privilege or the sort of like the role of who's allowed in the house. And I think the thing that really does confuse people or confuse and concerns people is the figures rolling down the grand staircase, sort of in this sense that it is, that it's a plaything or that it's really not. And I think it's really interesting to think about how other people perceive those types of spaces, in terms of, it's a house. And I'm sure that some of you have rolled down stairs or slid down a banister.
Definitely.
It's a thing we do as humans. So, but joking aside, I think important work of art to really look differently at our spaces through the eyes of an artist who can really take that and sort of make commentary on it.
Right.
I want to clarify too, because I see a comment from our previous director, Bill Bodine. So we said we weren't a collecting institution. That's not totally true. We are not active. We don't have dedicated funds to actively collecting art. So we have made strategic purchases in the past, and we do accept donations of artwork that fit with our mission. But I think as a single founder institution, where the collection is so shaped by one individual's personal tastes, it is really challenging to add to the collection and to find the right artworks that can add to the dialogue and kind of work to promote the story forward. And I think that's something we're really thinking about, and we have found that contemporary art is a great way of doing that.
Thank you. Thanks. I saw that as well, and I was going to ask you to clarify, please. I'm impressed, by the way. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm gonna, if you all are okay with it, I might veer and ask this one question that we received. It's from one of our guests. It said, could you each say more about how your founders' projects were perceived in their own time? A virtuous philanthropic act, an act of cultural theft or appropriation, silly distractions during the Depression, etc. Much of our discussion now is motivated by current conceptions of justice, the public, etc. But I'm wondering how it was received and perceived in its time, and how that might lead us to think differently about their intent. That's a great question. It's in the chat for anyone who wants to review it. That was a very, very well thought out question. So talking about our founders' projects, how they were perceived in the time, and what was the, I guess, the motivation, or what, why were they doing this?
I think the answer to that varies by whose perception we're talking about at the time. So, a phrase Isabella Stewart Gardner used is that when she left the museum as a public organization, an institution for the education and enjoyment of the public forever, public in her time, and when that happened in 1924, how, what's interesting about phrases like this is that it is open for interpretation by the curators, by the staff, by the director, by the board, and by the public. And if you're someone in that time period, let's say 1920s, who feels really comfortable and might have access and maybe privilege to travel to different places, to visit different cultural institutions, you might have one point of view. If you're someone who you and your family really stay in your own community, in your own neighborhood, which even happens today for a lot of people, you might see it as a place that's not for you. If you're someone who's just kind of really intrigued by it, we have lots of newspaper accounts of different visitors and how much they enjoyed it, or that they were surprised by different things at the time. And then there's the whole other layer of these different founders who, as Elee was saying before, like kind of competing against each other for what they were acquiring or what they were purchasing. And there's that different layer of society as well. So it's layered and it's complex in that way. And so I think what's interesting is that traditionally, or more historically, I should say, I think we often have skewed more towards telling the story through the founders' lens, or what set the founders apart. And I think what's interesting now is, again, what are these different perceptions both then and now, and kind of exploring that in various ways.
Yeah. If Dawn or Elee, if you want to say something about that, please do. But I also think that one of our questions sort of addresses this as well, which is, how do we honor the legacy of a founder, even if the mission and values of the institutions are changing? And if so, why are we compelled to do that? So again, how do we honor the legacy of the founder, even if our values are changing, perhaps, and why are we compelled to do so?
I think the answer is kind of in Michelle's answer from earlier. There's that, for the public welfare, for the public good, and how that definition is mutable over time, and it means different things to different people in different moments. And the way that we define value in our community today is different than how Helen Clay Frick might have defined it in 1970. I mean, her motivations in founding the art museum were very personal to her. I mean, it housed her personal art collection for others to see. And today, we're thinking more about how the museum can be a place where everyone feels valued and welcomed and respected, and that they share in an ownership of the collection and the direction of the institutions.
Mhm.
I think it's probably very similar for Henry Huntington. He just loved himself a book. He loved collecting books. He loved books. He just loved having them around, and he farmer, if you will, and really, like that drove him more than anything else, I think. But then sort of like, what can you do with it when you're done is maybe the bigger question, and that's maybe also an interesting thing to think about. Henry Huntington also sort of had this vision of Los Angeles as becoming a major cultural epicenter of something in the future. And so he sort of saw that part of his contribution was that the library would begin to shape some direction of what that would become.
Mhm.
And I mean, there's certain parameters that are guidelines or things that we follow in terms of Isabella Stewart Gardner's vision. And like I said, we can't move things around or take anything down or change it or add anything, which I think is really bold. Like, I love that idea that she had that forethought to say, no, this is my vision. This is the way it needs to look. And at the same time, not leaving labels to tell you what things are, I actually think is a really interesting choice as well, because it was very personal to her to travel, to collect art, and then to share it with others. She loved sharing it. She loved gathering different people together and express who could express different ideas and learn from one another. That's something that we continue now in our education approach, where we really focus on the visitor's experience and their perspective and help them find connections as they go. It's also really reflected in, as I was saying before, like these kind of different perspectives in who's telling the stories. So with that exhibition I was mentioning before, we have our curator, we have different community members, we have an artist whose parents grew up in the same neighborhood as the Black model, it's a contemporary artist named Lorraine O'Grady. We have someone from Wellesley College who wanted to dive deeper into the erasure of Thomas McKellar. So her name is Nikki Green, and wrote a great, beautiful essay for our catalog. So I think it's interesting to, there are things that are not changing, but then there are different ways that we can. It's an interesting opportunity to think about how we can learn from one another and from these objects in various ways.
Great, thank you. A few things that each of you said made me remember to say the following. So earlier in the talk, I said, how has this year changed us as an organization? How has it changed us personally? And we all were highly aware that when we would get together, we are 4 white museum staff members coming here to talk about this. And at least I will speak for the Frick, and then if you want to say anything, we've made as honest an effort as I believe we can, and if we're always wanting to learn and be better, to not just tell a story we think needs to be told, but make relationships with people that we have not made relationships with, and invite people in who have not felt welcome. And Dawn, if you want to add to that, I think I just wanted to acknowledge that we were aware of this. And I will say, as a museum professional, we know that's part of the problem. And it doesn't change quickly, but it can change. And I think from a conversation that we've all had before, we are all doing work, and we want to learn from one another. We've learned things from each other already about how to do this better, I'm just going to keep saying it, how to be better. So if anyone wants to comment on that, I just wanted to mention that. And that also, I think, is a good way to talk about how what is the role of museum staff in shaping meaning and memory? And who selects what is displayed and whose stories get told? It's us and many other people. And this year in particular, I think has sort of broke open a bit the personal and professional, and they're weaving together in really interesting ways so that we can do the best we can. And acknowledge, Dawn says to us often, I'm going to not say it exactly as you do, but acknowledge the past and be ready to move forward in however we can do so. So please, if anyone wants to respond to that, and again, the questions of what is the role of the museum staff in shaping meaning and memory, and who selects what is displayed and whose stories are told. Would you like me to?
Well, I'm gonna stick in one piece of information that I think for me as a staff member, something that's really important is that for wherever the money came from, whatever ill or good, use the inheritance that I have received from these people to do good in the community. That's part of my responsibility as the director of education, but also as one of the senior leaders within the institution, is that we have a responsibility, whatever that public welfare was at the time, it now is whatever public welfare needs to be done now. And I think that is really important, that all of us think about what's the right thing to do. We know that we need to increase and expand our collections to be more representative. So we're do that as best we can in the best ways that we can, given the circumstances. And I think that's the way a lot of us feel, is that we are the ones who can set that. And so we should take advantage of our responsibilities in that way.
Mm-hmm.
I think museum staff are more aware now than ever that we're in a position of power and privilege, that we select what goes on the walls, what stays in storage, what gets attention and what doesn't. And I think that process is changing, and it's also becoming more transparent. There's a section of the Frick Reflex where we try to pull that curtain back a little bit and pose some questions to our visitors about what makes an object meaningful and how do you assess meaning? How do you assess value? Is it based from a financial standpoint? Is it historical significance? There's a lot of questions. So we wanted visitors to think about the things that we think about and kind of share that responsibility. Mm-hmm. And we're looking at objects from a different perspective. I think we can look at all of the artifacts in Clayton that the Frick family interacted with and lived with and used. There are so many other individuals who interacted with those objects on a daily basis as well. And we can tell their stories through objects that might primarily have been interpreted from the family's point of view. And I also think that we can talk a lot about absence. I think the absence of objects and representation is just as meaningful as objects in our collection as well. And especially while you're trying to fill those gaps and add artists to the collection that represent different time periods, you can also talk about why you don't have them as well. And it's a conversation starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think building on a couple of the things, like the first part of what you asked, Lisa, where you're acknowledging like we're 4 white women on this panel. And so, calling that out in our work with our colleagues, making sure we think carefully about who's at the table, whose opinions and perspectives are we listening to, where are we going in the community to get a sense of what's happening right now. Yes. I think that's a huge shift that's happening just overall in the museum sector. Is just, I think everyone has been, a lot of institutions say things like, we want to be relevant. And it's like, but what does that actually mean? And how are you going about doing that? and that's a responsibility of all of your staff that are working in terms of, especially the ones that are thinking about what stories are told. And I also, you know, as an educator, I'm very interested in what stories are of interest to the visitor when they're coming in. And then also as a museum colleague, I'm fascinated by the stories of what we uncover and what we discover in the artwork that we have as well. So I think the interesting, in a way, it's like a challenge and an opportunity, is really the challenge to really pause and really think and work in really different ways, which often takes more time, but it can also result in really like deeper storytelling, if that makes sense. And also that I just wanted to point out, because I saw this was one of the questions in the Q&A, is that type of approach of thinking about which audiences are we, or perspective or aspirational audiences are we trying to work with or interact with, prioritizing those experiences is a choice. And sometimes, and again, the way you approach these types of stories is really different for some of the, you know, audiences that are really familiar with your museum, and not everyone likes these shifts that are happening, or doesn't always agree with or align with it. But at the same time, I think it's an interesting, again, opportunity for us to think about, you know, I have my experience, you have your response, and then what are other responses of others around us, and how can that help deepen or enrich my understanding of what's in front of me, or even help me understand different communities and their points of view. But I mean, overall, I think our response at least has been overwhelmingly positive. However, at the same time, our staff, we spend more time talking about why is the Gardner valuing or putting more emphasis on multiple perspectives, and why are we approaching it that way? That's woven into not only the programs and interpretation, but even like how you do your PR or how you tell the stories that way as well. So lots of interesting things to unpack with some of those questions.
Yeah, and that reminds me of something Elee said earlier, and that we had been talking about as well, is that who decides these things. And I would say that typically it's the curatorial staff, sort of from the base, but we are looking ahead. I think all of our organizations are looking ahead at making those decisions a little bit more together with some, you know, from curatorial staff to interpretive staff, education, programming, all of those people, including marketing, et cetera, that it's not an order that comes down or one idea that comes down. It's that from my perspective, we have all taken that responsibility and taken it very seriously and with great care. And I feel, for at least I'll say for the Frick, I feel very lucky that we are headed in this direction and are honest and open about those things. And I hope that that's happening. I would imagine that's happening where you both are as well. And this is our time. It's our chance, I think, to continue to open the doors wider, I guess, is a good way to say it. But also, I think what you said, Michelle, is we talk often about like bringing people in the doors and grabbing new audiences, and that's great, but it's more about engaging with other humans and other communities, and I think of it as how can we serve them? You know, my background's in like human service organization from years and years ago. So that always is in my head, how to serve best. And I really think that's what we're doing. And I think we're growing in how to do that and mixing our staffs together and our different perspectives, et cetera. Well, it is 8:05. And I would like to, if you are all okay with it, I'd like to maybe go through a few things in the chat, just any follow-up questions, or if anyone out there has any follow-up questions to what we've discussed, or anything you're interested, maybe we'll have to do a follow-up conversation about this. I feel like we could go on. but I'm gonna just scroll through quickly and see what some questions that we haven't answered are. Thank you, Amanda, for fixing the view. You're amazing. You always need a second. That's my my advice to you when you're doing a digital program. So some questions here are, and if you see any in the chat, other panelists, let me know.
Someone was asking about the constraints that we have at the Gardner where we can't change things. And it is really interesting because I think over 90% of what Gardner collected and is on view all the time. So that comes with other challenges because you can't rotate all those different things. But in terms of even though we can't necessarily change things in the historic building, we can take objects or pieces from the historic building and take a closer look at them and in relationship to other things from other museums, or perhaps maybe from the archives that we have, that those are stored away and we can bring those out. And we can do that in the newer portion of our building, as well as a few other areas for special exhibitions. And so we can do that for a few months and then we put the objects back. And so it's interesting because the way that Gardner installed it, she forces you to see it through her lens. You look at it in connection to the other objects in which it was placed. And then the curators do have a lot of opportunity to dive deeper, to research, and also find stories or aspects of the collection that they want to explore even further. So for example, we have a large painting by Titian called The Rape of Europa, and it's one of 6 pieces that were painted for King Philip II of Spain. And we worked out amazingly, even throughout all these challenges of COVID, a way to bring the 6 paintings back together. And so it's been over in England, it's going to Spain, it's coming back it'll come to the Gardner soon next year. That's so exciting to see these 6 pieces that have been distributed, but we're, temporarily you can see them together.
Right.
So there are interesting opportunities as well. You do have to be a little creative, I think, as a curator at the Gardner as well, but I think it's a lot of fun too.
Good. That's I was thinking about that when you were each speaking about the constraints and not being able to move some things or anything like that. So thank you for that. I want to ask, and Elee, I think, is typing an answer to this question as we speak, but if Dawn and Michelle want to answer, Bill Bodine asks, how are each of you approaching the stories of the servants who lived and worked in the houses which became your museums? Dawn?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. Since we are a more traditional historic house museum, we do the docent-led tours. Although Clayton has been closed since March, we are working on some virtual tour technology so that people will be able to experience the house online. But we do really rely on our frontline interpretive staff, many of who are in the audience right now, to forge those connections with visitors and share those inclusive stories. And you can't walk through Clayton without sharing stories of the staff who worked there. And I think the Frick is fortunate to have a wealth of information. Not only do we know the names of many of the domestic servants who worked at the house, but we have information about their payroll, how long they were with the Frick family, and we know a little bit of bio about them from other sources, but there's still so much more to know. So I think they play a small part. They should play an even bigger part. I think we'd like to have a more regularly available domestic servant tour. We've done it as kind of one-off thematic installations in the house where we focus on it for, a few months of the year. But I think that will probably change going forward. And we're really thinking about interpretation of Clayton and how we can tell more stories than just the usual house tour.
Mm-hmm.
What I was going to type was that, as I mentioned earlier, the work that we invite researchers to come in and do additional work to help us understand and kind of unearth that missing information. We actually have it. It's just that nobody's ever looked at it. So that's one way of getting out there. But we've also been doing some or of garden staff over time as a way of continuing to build our knowledge of who has really been involved in the shaping of the institution over time. So there's a lot of work to be done. I think that's there's never an end to the investigation that can happen, which in some weird, bizarre way is one of the reasons why our institution was founded, was to explore and expand our knowledge. And
Mhm.
so, you could, I guess we're kind of getting there.
Yes. Michelle, would you mind if I moved on, or do you want to say
No,
something?
I was just going to say that we're doing more research about those that worked with Gardner or for Gardner, as well as the construction teams that built the museum, and
Yeah.
following up on various archival material to help with that. So I think it's a great question.
Yeah.
So yeah, more coming soon.
Always more coming soon. I feel like this is going to seem like a plug for the Frick, but it is a comment that I want to read to everyone, because I think that it is a goal, squad goals for us. So one of our guests said, I am a Frick neighbor and member, and I have struggled with the issues around the white privilege I enjoy while living so close to a more traditionally Black neighborhood. The Frick was the first local arts organization I noticed that named and claimed that issue, and I am grateful. So thank you for that comment. It's good for us to hear. And I think that what stood out to me especially was that to claim and name an issue, even if you're confused about it, or even if you have questions about it, is to not talk about it. That's why we're here today, talking about these things, helping each other. It's sort of interesting to see how we're each doing certain things, and maybe giving us a little bit of a push to do more, or give us different strategies, which I'm very grateful for. So I thank you for that comment. And I'll say we'll do 2 more questions, if that's okay. And we have plenty more. So I apologize to everyone that we did not get to. I think if you are really interested in the answers to these questions, I welcome you to email the Frick after, and we can share them with Elee and Michelle, and they would be happy to respond. Let's see. How do you balance our current desire to investigate with the right to be forgotten that exists more strongly in some other countries? That's a good one.
Well, it's kind of funny. I don't know how many people would know who Henry Huntington was if you didn't actually come to the Huntington. I didn't know anything about who he was before I got here. So I think it's kind of interesting, these single named places, how much of that really matters now in 100 years later. He's probably rolling in his grave, going to come after me, right? But I think it's interesting to think about, why or how does that name matter in terms of what we're doing? And is it the name that matters, or is it the work that we've been put forth to do? I don't know. It's interesting. It's sort of that question of the overarching problem of humanity, is that we all die at some point and wish to have a legacy.
Anyone else want to say anything, or?
I mean, all 3 museums, the name of the institutions include the founder's name. So I think, at least at our institutions, they did not want to be forgotten. And then how do you, I think, again, like even like when someone was asking about servants, what components of the founder, or what aspects of their life do you research, or prioritize studying a little bit further? And it is a really interesting question about what legacy they left behind, and what people would choose to leave today.
Yeah. Dawn, I'm going to move on to the next question, or do you want to speak
No.
as well? Okay.
That's such a weighty question. I
It
love
is
it.
yes.
Especially with Frick. I mean, I think his name can never disappear in Pittsburgh history, I think in American history. I think of the three names, Frick is probably the most notorious. And I don't know, going back to what you were saying, name it to tame it. I think we have to understand the full picture of the man to really understand the time and his daughter and the time in which they lived.
I think this will be our, gosh, there's so many good ones. I don't want this to be our final, but I think I'll make this our final question. How will you take this conversation to your visitors? Will you shape it? And how will you shape it? Will it be age-based, students, adults, et cetera, et cetera? So how will we take these conversations and bring them to our visitors?
One program that we have been working on that this fits into very nicely with our school programs is called Learning Through the Collections. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about is who collected it and why, and how does that change what we think about it? What does it mean when we look at it? So that's one way that we can do it. And also continuing to have those conversations in various places, not necessarily specifically as a program, but in how we choose what we choose to put out for different audience groups.
Yes.
I think I've worked at the Gardner for almost 16 years, and the way that I was trained in how to tell the founder story is very different than how we tell it today. It's even different from how we would have done it 2 years ago. So I think as long as there's an openness for that kind of evolution of the storytelling to meet the visitor's needs, regardless of who it is, I think there's always some core fundamental facts or things that we typically share about Gardner and her life or her interests and passions and why the museum looks the way that it does. And then part of it is kind of being open-ended of like, what questions do the visitors have? I will say more and more over the past 5 years, and it happens with almost every group that walks in the door, they will ask, where does the wealth or where does the money for the founder, where did that come from? And so which I think is a great question. We're asking that about, the upper 1% of our country and others today as well. And so, I think what's great is that when you have collaborative staff that are working on different aspects of learning more about these things and really, kind of brainstorming together what's working, what are visitors having questions about, but, the same questions typically come up from visitors regardless of who they are, which I think is really interesting. And that in itself might give the museum some clues or tips of like what aspects of the story to dive a little deeper into, or maybe to think about how that story is being told, which is also exciting. Yeah. Where did the money come from? Definitely. Yes. Good question. Yes.
I will say from a programming perspective at the Frick, we're doing more conversational programs, and we also have opened a weekly Q&A for anybody interested to come to ask questions, to discuss. But I think we're still and constantly working to discuss how we will shape it and how we will get people to come, how we will deliver our message, and how we will engage people as it's relevant to them as well. And I'm not going to ask the group, but I'm going to say as a follow-up that someone asked in making the museums more accessible to minorities, how do you make Gilded Age European art collections relevant to their lives? So I think that's something we're dealing with, is that's what we're asking right now, is how do we become or stay relevant in utilizing what we have and looking at it differently, but also then how do we branch out? How do we extend to have this constant ongoing conversation with our visitors? And I think that we're learning too, that the conversation is ever changing and ever growing with visitors. It does not stop. So this is our current conversation. It will always be part of it, but we will, as things become more visitor centric, which I think they are, that will be a question that we will continue to ask over and over and over again. And we will ask them. We will ask the people that come and those that don't. Michelle?
Yeah, and I think kind of building on that, I don't think I've ever used the phrase Gilded Age when I've explained about Gardner or about that era. I tend to use more dates or kind of putting in context of other things. But it's just as relevant now for single founder museums that exist in the, whether it's in America or other places. There's a lot of single founder museums, particularly in America, that are popping up in the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Just like in the Gilded Age, there was a like we're all talking about our organizations. There's quite a few that are opening now, and for what purpose, and
Right.
The mission, and the choices, and especially a lot of the contemporary art is not always representational and might be a little bit more confusing and needs more context. So there's there's a lot. The conversation continues even with current practices too, in new institutions.
And that's what we in some of the examples that I showed, where we're trying to put contemporary art alongside historic art, because it turns out that people like art from all kinds of backgrounds. It doesn't necessarily, like, just because you are of one background doesn't mean you don't appreciate art from another, but you have to be able to understand it in a different perspective or context. So I think that's where we've really been successful in juxtaposing things together, because then it does help you see what is it you're really looking at and keeping it within sort of like in the same frame. It works well to put contemporary portraits with historic portraits, because then you can talk about portraits, and that's really what you're trying to get at, is sort of the idea of who's in the picture. So there's lots of ways that you can do it. I think it's important to find out what people are interested in and then go from there.
Agreed. Well, thank you. I really want to keep going and talking. And I think some comments we've had and some other conversations we had that we might do it. So that makes me happy. And I want to thank our attendees for being so engaging and giving us your feedback and your comments. And we wouldn't be doing anything but talking to the screen without you. So thank you for that. And Dawn, always a pleasure. Thank you. Michelle, also always a pleasure. Thank you. And Elee, thank you so much. I appreciate it and look forward to being with you again. All right.
Great. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll talk soon, okay?
Sounds good. Be safe and healthy, everyone.
Great. Stay safe.
You can stay on and check the comments. There's a lot of thank yous, etc. Oh, someone from the Taft Museum. Tamara will have to talk. Yes, agreed. Thank you, Inez. Appreciate your comment. This is lovely. Someone said it was illuminating. We're illuminating now. So exciting.
Great.
Why did you run away, Dawn?
I did. I was so embarrassed by your sweet comments that apparently I exited the meeting.
So she's done. She's out.
Thank you, Michelle and Elee. This was
Sure.
a pleasure. I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I'm encouraged that other museums are here and just want to widen this circle in this discussion. I think that's a good thing. So thank you to both of you for coming and joining us. Okay, I'm going to stay on and watch the chat, but you're welcome to go if you want, and I will be in touch with you. Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Have a great night.
Great.
All right.
Thanks. Take
Bye.
care, everybody.
Will do.
Bye.
Bye bye.